Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats. In light of recent events in Israel and the horrific terrorist attack on October 7th, 50 years after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which President Nixon ordered a swift resupply of arms and materiel to Israel to help repel the invading Egyptian and Syrian armies, we will focus today's keynote session on the next steps that America should take to respond strategically to this geopolitical aggression and to get our American hostages back. Obviously, this is a complicated and rapidly evolving situation, and there is no one better to address these topics than Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Chairman of American Global Strategies, who served as the 27th National Security Advisor, the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, and he's Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. Ambassador O'Brien is joined on stage today by Morgan Ortagus, the founder and principal at Polaris National Security. She's an active U.S. Navy Reserve officer and served in the Trump administration as the spokesperson at the Department of State for the United States. Would you please welcome our keynote?
Well, it's so great to be back. Hopefully I didn't lull you to sleep with an hour of sanctions talk. Hope you enjoyed that panel. I'm very excited to have this conversation with Ambassador O'Brien, who I've known for probably 15 years now. Many years ago, we were on the board of a small NGO in Afghanistan that brought young Afghan lawyers to the US to get an LLM. And sadly, it all came full circle 2 years ago with that disastrous withdrawal, because Robert and I had to get many of those students, many of those law students that we brought to the US, we had to get them out of Afghanistan very quickly. And we did. We got a lot out, but it was an odd way to come full circle. But Robert, we had the amazing discussion last night. Yeah, go for it.
Do we have audio here? Okay, great. One of the things I want to say, I know Qatar has gotten a lot of a hard time recently because of the Hamas folks that are there. I don't think they'll be there very long after Hamas is destroyed on the ground. But it was Qatar that they got the folks out of Afghanistan when we couldn't get any help from the U.S. government. We got our allies and the people that we trained here and put a lot of money into under both Secretary Rice and Secretary Clinton. We got them out of Afghanistan with the help of Qatar, and I appreciate that.
That's a really great point. I mean, when we were trying to get our students out, we didn't go to our own government. We had to go to Qatar to get them out, and thankfully, thank God they did. But Robert, that was an amazing intro that you did for Secretary Pompeo last night. So we heard that discussion. We've heard a lot of intense policy discussions today. What's your favorite part of the conference so far?
Well, this conference and this summit is different than any other summit, I think, in our conference in Washington, D.C. And I think there are two things. The speakers that we have, so I just think of, like this morning, we had Waltz and Jane Harmon and Admiral Rogers. Any one of those three could have been a national security advisor. Then we had the following session, we had Pottinger, who was the deputy national security advisor. We had Kitamura-san, who was Prime Minister Abe's national security advisor. I mean, the thoughtfulness and the substance that you're getting and the people that are here, it's pretty unusual for a Washington, D.C. conference. Usually you operate and do this better than I do, Morgan, but we're doing 4-minute, 5-minute sound bites or segments on Fox or on CNN. And when you come here and listen to this conference, you're getting strategy and substance that I think President Nixon would have been really happy about.
I agree. So thank you again for having us. So there's so many different stories to tell from your time in the Trump administration, but you were also in the Bush administration as well. I would just like you to sort of peel back the onion and tell us the differences in working in the Bush administration versus the Trump administration, and what you think about the overall foreign policy and grand strategy behind both administrations.
Yeah, the biggest difference is I was a pretty junior person in the Bush administration, so I didn't have a plane and didn't have Secret Service, so that's probably the biggest difference. And look, President Bush was a great president. He had, challenges like President Trump had. I mean, we had the Iraq War. I spent a lot of time at the UN in the Bush administration. We were dealing with Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and dealing with some of those very, very tough issues. And I think it was good prep for the Trump administration. People ask, it was baptism by fire in Trump, but we had a pretty big baptism by fire after the second Gulf War in the Bush administration, and so it was certainly good training. But I think the idea of President Bush and President Trump is that they're both pretty tough guys. And I know President Trump better than I know President Bush, but know President Bush. I'm a fan of his. And you wouldn't have had what we're seeing now. We're seeing the world fall apart on us. And you wouldn't have had that with either President Bush or President Trump being in power, because they both believed in peace through strength. And President Trump called it America First, but it's Ronald Reagan. It's peace through strength. And it goes back to Nixon. It's realism. It's using American hard power to back up our diplomacy. And so you can have peace initiatives, and you can be successful with them, but you have to have the strength to get there. You can't just have peace without the strength. And that's what we saw with President Nixon. We saw it with President Bush. And we saw it certainly with President Trump. And unfortunately, with our Democrat friends who are all about the peace but don't understand strength and American exceptionalism, it's hard to get to the end of peace when you're appeasing your adversaries and not standing up to them.
So most of people know you from the Trump administration from being the national security advisor, but you actually started as the hostage envoy. And what people may not know is you were able to successfully get more Americans out of captivity, or more Americans who were wrongfully detained out, than any presidency in the history of the United States. So you were clearly a very credible and highly effective hostage envoy. What was your secret?
Well, it was, in some ways it was easy, and I don't take credit. I give the credit for the hostages coming home to President Trump, because when you're president, you get credit for when things go well, you should get credit for that. When things go poorly, your staff should take the blame for it. But it did make it a little easier when I had President Trump. I could go into negotiations and say, look, do you want to cut a deal with me and work it out, or do you want me to take it to the president's desk? And I have no idea what he's going to do. The other thing I'll say is, and this is really important, I mentioned Qatar. Let me also mention Switzerland, and Jacques Pitalud, the Swiss ambassador, is here. We were able to get a lot of people out of a lot of countries because we had partners that believed, that shared our values, and that believed in getting innocent people home. And so whether it was working with Jacques and Wolfgang Brühlhardt and the Swiss government, which was just, what Switzerland does for America, no one will understand outside of the government. Roger Carstens will tell you about it, our current hostage envoy. They facilitate getting people home. The Qataris did it. The Emiratis did it. It wasn't just President Trump, but we had a lot of partners who were against terrorism, against kidnapping, against hostage taking, and we leveraged those relationships as well. The final thing I'll say is that we use the military. And that's something, when I first got to the hostage envoy office, there was a memo that described what the SPIHA office did. And the first thing it said, we use diplomacy and military option. The military option is always the last resort. And I took the memo and started editing it, and I said, we use our military option as a first resort. That's why we have Delta Force. That it was created after the debacle in Iran with Desert Eagle. I said, we're going to rescue our hostages first. Only then will we turn to diplomatic means. And we wanted to send a message to our adversaries, especially the non-state actors, the terrorists who were taking our people hostage, that we're coming after you. And we're going to rescue our hostages and eliminate you so that you can't do this again. And we had a number of successful hostage rescues in addition to the diplomatic work that was done. So I think it was a combination of, on the diplomacy front, being able to play good cop to President Trump's bad cop, working with our allies and our friends and our like-minded partners, and then using the exquisite capabilities of the U.S. military to rescue hostages whenever we could.
And the audience should know you did all of that, and you got more Americans home than any other presidency in the history of the United States, and you did it all for $0.
We didn't pay ransom. In fact, well, one of the first things that came through when I took the job, it was very quickly, and I won't mention the country, but an interlocutor came to us and said, the Iranians are prepared to release hostages, and you know what the price is. And the price they were asking for was a price that the Obama administration paid for in the JCPOA, about $400 million per hostage. I said, yeah, I don't think our Iranian friends understand who they're dealing with now, because I'm not going to go tell President Trump or Secretary Pompeo that we're going to pay $400 million per American hostage. That's not going to happen, ever. And we didn't, and we said we brought 3 hostages home from Iran among the 58 others that we brought home. And we didn't pay a dime of ransom to any country, including to North Korea, which asked us to pay for the medical treatment of Otto Warmbier. And Otto's story was particularly sad, but we got him home before he died, although he was in bad shape. We refused to pay for that medical care. We didn't pay a dime to any terrorist organization or to any pariah state, whether it was China or Russia or Iran. So it got to a point towards the end of the administration where foreign governments or terrorist organizations didn't even ask us to pay. Because they knew it wasn't going to happen. And the good news is we had some other big countries like France. President Macron, I give him credit. President Macron changed his government's policy. France used to pay ransom, or at least was reported to have paid ransom. And the French stopped paying ransom. And then the Italians stopped paying ransom. But once America starts paying ransom, we can't go out to our allies and like-minded partners and tell them, don't negotiate with terrorists, don't pay ransom. When we do it, it opens the spigots and opens the doors, and it creates a market for future hostage taking. You put a price tag on a blue passport or on a Western passport. But the second thing you do, and I said this at the time of this most recent Iran deal, is when you give Iran $5 or $6 billion for 5 Americans, you're not only creating a market for them to take new hostages because it's a rational economic decision at that point, but you're funding future terrorism. I said this at the UN a couple of weeks ago. I said, you're going to fund the drone makers who are killing Ukrainians.
Right.
Well, what I didn't understand, Morgan, is how quickly and how vividly both those points, that we'd have future hostages and terrorist activity taking place the way we did in southern Israel with Hamas. There's a direct correlation between what we did with Iran and what happened in southern Israel, and it's a shame. It's bad for America, bad for the world, certainly bad for our Israeli friends. But this is what paying ransom results in.
It's foreign policy malpractice. The last thing on the hostages, because I do want you to tell this somewhat funny story. I got a call when we had an American that had been imprisoned, and it was a rapper. And listen, we care about all Americans individually. Doesn't matter if you're famous or not famous, but I am one for classical music, so I did not know who this rapper was, but I knew he was important. And I spoke to his representative and said, well, I'm good friends with Robert O'Brien. Don't worry, I'm going to get him on the phone. I'll tell Pompeo this is clearly important. So I called my staff in and I said, guys, we have an American arrested. We need to get on this right away with the SPIHA staff. His name's ASAP Rocky. Oh, so you guys, his name's ASAP Rocky. So it just goes to show what a boomer I am. And you all are quite nerdy, because you guys didn't get it either, did you?
Anyone under 30 knows who he is.
So tell us about how you got ASAP Rocky out of prison.
Well, so I was involved in the Abraham Accords. I was involved in the Serbia-Kosovo normalization, some big operations like the Baghdadi raid. On my tombstone, ASAP Rocky, this is the guy who got ASAP Rocky out. I didn't know who ASAP Rocky was. My daughters were very impressed when they heard I was going to try and get ASAP Rocky out of captivity. And he was being held by Sweden. So it's a little bit unusual. But I'd come home to Los Angeles for the weekend. I commuted home, and it was a Saturday morning. I think I was running to the store. And the phone rang, and I picked up and said, please hold for the secretary. And it was Secretary Pompeo. He said, I need you on a flight to Sweden, to Stockholm, like today or tomorrow, the next flight out of LA to Stockholm. I said, okay, what's the mission? He said, well, we've got to get ASAP Rocky out of jail, out of Swedish jail. Usually I'm dealing with Lebanon or Algeria or Yemen or someplace like that, Iran, China, Russia. I said, okay. And I said, what tools do I have? He goes, the president is very serious about this. He expects him to be out very quickly. And I said, okay, well, I'll undertake the mission. I'll go. So I flew, and Secretary Pompeo said, listen, you can tariff, you can put tariffs on IKEA or Volvo if you need to. I said, okay, that'll help. So I got to Sweden, and the Swedes weren't very happy. The Swedish government wasn't very happy to see me. And I said, well, we need to get him out. The president thought he had to deal with the prime minister of Sweden. Apparently, the president's understanding and the prime minister of Sweden's understanding were different. Although I think the prime minister of Sweden may have changed his views a bit, subject to political pressure in Sweden. ASAP Rocky, to be totally blunt here, he would have never been prosecuted in LA or New York or San Francisco. He and his guys were stalked by a couple of migrants from the Middle East that attacked him. The mistake the guys from the Middle East made is you don't attack a rapper and his posse because it's not going to end well. And they kind of got beat up after they attacked him. The Swedes took the position that there was too much force. Once they had the guys on the ground, and there was one or two kicks too many to defend. So it went beyond self-defense, and so they were going to keep ASAP and two members of his team in jail for some time. I had to explain to the Swedes that, listen, this is U.S. credibility is now at stake. The president has tweeted that ASAP Rocky is coming home at the end of the week, and I've got to go from here to Lebanon, and I've got a very important negotiation that Jacques knows about on an Iranian hostage, and I can't be seen as having failed in Sweden and expect to get somebody out of a hellhole in the Middle East because our credibility was shot. And they said, well, there's nothing we can do. We've got our laws. And I said, well, the king can pardon him. And they said, well, the king's in the south of France. I said, well, I'm happy to go see the king in the south of France, but he needs to pardon me. He said, well, that's not how it works. And I said, well, here's how it's going to work. ASAP's going to be on a plane by the end of the week, and it's very important to us. And I said, it'd be terrible if if you lost your Volvo plant in South Carolina, and which I felt bad doing because I like the Swedes. And
Volvo does have the most comfortable seats.
Yeah, great car. And so, they were going to do a trial, and I said, look, it'd be good if he was, if you convict him, you convict him, but he's got to be let out for time served on Friday. He's got to go home at the end of the trial. They said, no, we're not doing that. And on Thursday, by the way, going to court, more press than I've ever seen in my life, including at the White House when I was National Security Advisor. There were like 250 press guys accredited to the trial. And no one would talk. The Swedes were very professional. Their prosecutors wouldn't talk. There were no leaks coming out of the court or out of the prosecution office. So the only thing the press had was me arriving in the morning and leaving at night. And they'd all, bunched together. The Swedes actually were very nice and provided police escort, up and down to get through the press. And ASAP Rocky was released at the end of the week, which was very nice. It all worked out well, and we ended our relationship on a nice note with the Swedes. A month later, I'm made National Security Advisor. My first meeting at the UN at the UNGA is with the Swedish Foreign Minister to talk about North Korea. And I walked in, and they were a little apprehensive. I thought they'd be mad at me. They thought I'd be mad at them, and we hugged it out, and we had a great relationship with Sweden for the next year and a half, and they're a great partner and now NATO ally, and so all's well ends well. But the best part is I ended up at the head of intelligence in Lebanon, in Beirut, a week later. I sat down with our ambassador and this general, very tough guy, warlord, Middle Eastern guy, and the first thing he says is, "My kid said you're involved in ASAP Rocky." I said, I get to Beirut and I'm being asked about ASAP Rocky, so that was my 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol would say.
So we're Republican foreign policy professionals. What happens when you get to, the pinnacle of a career in national security, which is to be asked by the President of the United States to be his national security advisor? How do you prepare for that moment, and how do you rise to the occasion? I can only imagine when you went into the office that so many legends before you sat in. How do people in this room that are dreaming about having that job one day, how do you prepare for it, and how did you take on the pressure?
Yeah, so one, I've got a great wife, Lo Marie, who's in the front row here, and she supported me all through the hostage envoy days, so thank you, Lo Marie. And so that was number one. I mean, preparing for it with President Trump was a little unusual because I'd interviewed for the job, but there was a list of 10 people that were up. And look, I've had this happen many times before. I'm always like the Republican to be named later in a trade, so they always fill in the list of 10. I'm always the 9th or 10th person that they kind of throw in there. So I'd called my wife. I'd heard about this. I was in Israel working on trying to get some IDF soldiers home from Gaza, from Hamas. I called my wife and I said, I'm on this list, but I'm going straight home to LA. I'm not going to go to D.C. It's not going to happen. And Lomri said, no, go to D.C. At least do the interview. So I interviewed with the president, flew home to California that weekend, and the president was actually in California doing a fundraiser, asked me to see him again. I met with him. I thought he offered me the job, but our good friend Pete Wilson, who a lot of you know, a great governor of California, former senator and Reagan board, he is a Reagan board member, but he's also a Nixon board member, was with me. And the president asked Pete to come in for the interview. He asked me how well I knew Pete, and I said, I've known since I was 16, so I've known Pete for a long time. So, Governor, come on in. I thought the president offered me the job, and I walked out of the room, and I said, I think he just offered me the job. And Pete said, Yeah, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say anything. So we found out the next morning by tweet. We woke up at 6:30 in the morning when the phone started, ringing, and lo and behold, turned on the TV, and the tweet was on that I'd been offered the job, or it was being appointed on by Twitter. So that's how.
Well, at least you didn't get fired by Twitter.
Yeah, I did not get fired by Twitter, as a number of people did. So I was able to. I was the only national security advisor President Trump didn't fire, so I got that going for me. But no, listen, I'm from California. I'm outside of D.C. But I had the opportunity to work at the UN as a young lawyer. I'd been, like you, a reservist. Morgan's not just a Fox commentator and spokesperson and pretty face. She's also a Navy reservist and intel officer and a kick-ass warrior. And I had the opportunity to serve in the Army Reserve as a JAG officer. I had the opportunity to work in Switzerland, in Geneva, for the UNCC and organize the Security Council as a younger lawyer. Had the opportunity to work in the Bush administration. I worked on a couple of presidential campaigns, all of which lost. So you don't want me on your presidential campaign. I'm bad luck. So ask Governor Romney about that, and Governor Walker. So if I endorse a presidential campaign, I'm being careful about endorsing President Trump again, because if I do, he'll lose. So I told him, I'm with you, sir. I support you 100%, but don't get me too far out in front, because I'm bad luck on a big campaign. And then I obviously did the Afghanistan work with you, Morgan. You did a great job on that program, and then the hostage envoy work. And so over a career, you develop an appreciation for the threats that face America. And I was lucky enough to grow up. I remember President Nixon as a young man, and then kind of came of age politically during the Reagan years, and it was all about peace through strength. And so I understood that if a strong America was good for our country and our countrymen and keeping us safe, and that was a prayer I said every morning before I left my apartment to go to work at the White House. Was a pretty simple prayer. It's like, help me keep America safe today. And I knew we'd keep our allies safe. If a strong America wasn't just good for us here in the U.S., but it was good for our friends in Israel and Europe and Asia and around the world, Australia. And so it was peace through strength. And that's really what prepared me, was growing up watching President Nixon, President Reagan, the Bushes, and kind of getting an understanding of what our adversaries, weakness is provocative, and when our adversaries see us as weak or perceive us to be weak, even if we're not, fundamentally, they'll try and take advantage of it. And so my whole goal every day going into the Trump White House was to work with the president to keep America safe by being strong.
So let's just say, fast forward and say this is the afternoon of January 20th, 2025. The Republican nominee has won and is the presidency, and let's just say you're going in some form in that administration. After Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, Hamas in Israel, and God forbid whatever else comes in the next year and a half, how do you clean up this mess?
Yeah, look, it's not going to be easy. Mike Pompeo and I were talking about this last night before his speeches. We knew things wouldn't go as well as it did with us, and it's not a criticism of President Biden. It's just the Democrat approach to foreign policy is a very different approach than the GOP approach, unless you've got someone like Jane Harman or Michelle Fuller. And I hate to mention them, because if I ever mention a Democrat who's good on foreign policy, it's probably bad for their career. But if you don't have a strong America and a peace through strength foreign policy and a pro-American foreign policy, things aren't going to go well in the world. So we immediately have to turn around the way we speak to the world. And that doesn't mean being belligerent. It means being, like Teddy Roosevelt talked about, being quiet. And then the second thing is carrying a big stick. We have to make sure our military is the best military in the world, that our warfighters have the platforms, the weapon systems, everything they need to defend themselves. So that people like Morgan, my two daughters, Loma and my daughters, are both on active duty now, young lieutenants, and we got to make sure the kids and the men and women who are serving us have everything they need to keep themselves safe, but also to defeat our adversaries. And that's what deters bad behavior. That's what deters malign activity, is if they know that the United States is strong and that we're willing to exercise our strength if necessary. Now, one thing I'll point out, that works and deterrence works. We did not start a new war under President Trump. Think about, when's the last president that didn't have a new military engagement? Now, we took out a lot of bad guys. We defended our troops. We defended our embassies. But we didn't start a new war under the Trump administration. just like Ronald Reagan did. We had Grenada, but that was kind of a giant hostage rescue of the medical students. But we were able to do that because our adversaries knew that we were strong and that we were prepared to use overwhelming force to defend our interests if necessary. And so there's a humility in that you don't send the 82nd Airborne, like Mike said last night, to solve every crisis. But if your adversaries know that the 82nd Airborne or the 101st or a Marine MEU or the Air Force or Navy are ready to engage, if American red lines are crossed, then we'll. That's how we'll clean up the mess. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be very complicated for the next president.
Speaking of the military, we are at historic recruiting lows. I mean, we just can't get people to sign up, except for the Marines. God bless them. People still want to be Marines. I think I just saw yesterday.
It's the uniforms. They've got great uniforms.
I know, that's true. Anyway, I married a Marine once. He's an ex. Sorry. We're got to keep it lively, Robert. But we do have historic recruitment lows. I think the Navy just missed their mark by 20%. And you've got a whole generation of young people that have been indoctrinated that this is a racist nation, this is a nation founded on white supremacy, and suddenly everyone is surprised that nobody wants to sign up to fight and die for that country. I think our recruitment crisis amongst the services is almost a bigger problem than our very slow military industrial base. So how do you fix that problem?
Well, it's a great question, Morgan. And look, most of it, one of the things that many of you know, and maybe some of you don't know, is that most of our military recruits come from families that the parents and grandparents and uncles served in the military. And those people are generally traditionalists. They believe in America. They believe in American exceptionalism. And so when the military, it's not just the culture, it's not just the universities, which are bad enough with the wokeness and the anti-Americanism, and we're seeing, gosh, this horrific anti-Semitism that's taking place on American university campuses, which everybody should deplore, and no one should hire any kid who goes out and says that they're in favor of Hamas killing innocent Israelis and slitting the throats of babies. That kid shouldn't be hired. I'm sorry, I'm all for free speech, but there are consequences that come with your speech. And supporting terrorism is an outrage. So I can't tell you how happy I was when I saw Bill Ackman, who's a Democrat and big hedge fund guy in New York, come out and say he and others weren't going to hire these students from Harvard that signed the letters supporting Hamas. It's one thing to talk about Palestinian rights and a two-state solution and to be within the bounds of decency. But when you're supporting Hamas and saying this is what, I think one professor tweeted out, what did you think decolonization was going to look like? In other words, genocide against Jews is how we're going to take Israel back. That's abhorrent. And so we've got that going on college campuses where you don't expect to find it, Morgan, is in the military. And unfortunately, we've seen, I think the Air Force Academy is probably the worst. We've seen they've got the equivalent of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion students or officers that are acting like political commissars in the Air Force. I mean, I read about this. I didn't know about it when I was National Security Advisor. I read about it in the Wall Street Journal from a kid who left the Air Force Academy, gave up his scholarship, and didn't want to be involved in it anymore because of what was happening at the academy. And I know the senior military leadership doesn't want to take it seriously, but if we don't take it seriously, we're going to have a hollowed out military because kids aren't going to want to fight and die for the greatest country in the history of the world. And President Biden talked about this the other night, and I was happy to see him. I was asked for commentary on it. I said, I'm really glad to see President Biden talking about this being the greatest country in the history of the world. It is the greatest country. It's the strongest country. It's an amazing place. But if we denigrate our own country in our universities and in the military, people aren't going to want to go take a bullet for this country. And we've got to change that immediately and start instilling pride again. I think one of the reasons is that under General Berger, the Marine Corps refused to go woke. The training standards are still high. There's an esprit de corps that you have in the Marines, and they've pushed back as hard as they can against what was in the Obama White House and now in the Biden White House of this wokeness in the military. I think the Marines have done the best job of pushing back on it, and that's why their recruiting is high, is they've kept their standards high and people want to meet those standards. The other branches of the service need to do the same thing as the Marines have done. There's no place for politics, and I'm not suggesting that there's, the job of the services isn't to create little Republicans. or it's not a college Republican club or a young Republican club. It should be totally non-political. I mean, people shouldn't know what political party their captain or their major or their colonel's in. It should be totally devoid of politics. And so we need to get back to that ideal.
So we know that a week and a half ago, we obviously lost over 1,400 Israelis, but importantly, we lost 30 Americans. I believe that's the most Americans that we've lost in a terror attack since 9/11. We know that we have at least 14 that are held hostage right now. What is the appropriate American response when terrorists have killed that many Americans?
So this is something that's been quite disturbing to me the past week or 10 days. And to be honest, I don't understand what's going on. When America has been attacked in the past, the response of Secretary Baker, Secretary Schultz, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Rice would be, look, if you're a terrorist, we're going to find you. You've killed Americans, you've taken Americans hostages, we're going to kill you, we're going to find you, and we're going to bring you to justice. Just like we did with Baghdadi and ISIS and shutting down the caliphate. The idea Ronald Reagan said, you can run but you can't hide. That was always America's response when we were hit with terrorism. And now we've got grief for the families, which is important, and we've got it. And Tony Blinken's a very eloquent Secretary of State. He's speaks better French than I do by far, so he's got that going for him. But
That's about it.
He wants to stand by Israel, and that's important too, that we stand by Israel. But where's the outrage about what has happened to American citizens and Americans being killed? I don't see it, and I've never seen an administration respond to a crisis in this manner. I mean, we're the United States of America. We defend our citizens and we rescue our hostages, and there's been nothing on that front. Now, the best case scenario, and again, I do caveat everything I say, I was much smarter about national security before I was National Security Advisor, and I'm much smarter after I've been in office. When you're in office, it's a little tougher. You're trying to muddle through sometimes and get the best result for the country. And look, Jake Sullivan, who replaced me, is a good man, and I'm sure he's doing his best. And maybe there's some negotiation going on now with Qatar or some other country to get the Americans home, and I hope that is. And maybe there's a reason for the quietness. But once they're home, we better figure out how to get our voice back as the United States of America and let the terrorists and let those that would do us harm, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party or the Russians or the North Koreans or whoever it is, that if you do America harm, you're going to pay a heavy price, and there's going to be a massive consequence. Because if you don't, again, it gets back to this idea of weakness being provocative. We're going to see one malign act after another like this. And killing Americans and taking them hostage is about the worst thing that can, by a two-bit terrorist organization like Hamas, is about the worst thing you can do. And I hope we come down on Hamas like a ton of bricks once the Israelis, if there's anything left when the Israelis get done with them. I hope we come after them hard, so that other terrorist organizations understand that if you take, there'll be a major price to pay if you take American lives or take Americans hostage. It's just unfathomable the way we've kind of conducted things so far, and unless there's something going on that I have no idea of, and I hope there is.
What is, so you were with President Trump on a daily basis. What's one thing that we all don't know about him that you learned about him from your time as National Security Advisor?
So, I don't know if President Trump would like me to say this because he might think it sounds weak, but he's an incredibly cordial man, especially in his dealings with foreign leaders. And I was with him on every phone call. And the amount of sympathy, especially during COVID, that he showed for foreign leaders and foreign governments, friends and foes, who were battling COVID and who were trying to get through the crisis, was really impressive. He showed a lot of empathy, which is not something that I think the general public would associate with President Trump. He was incredibly kind. He was generous. We gave ventilators out to countries around the world, including some countries that were adverse to us but were suffering. And he's, I used to say he was our best diplomat because he's so good in these environments with foreign governments. Tough, always tough. He was never going to back down on his belief that America was the greatest country in the world and that America should come first. But he was always very, very cordial. I think that's something that people wouldn't understand, from the outside, that he was really a great diplomat. Being tough is part of being a diplomat, but someone once said being a good diplomat is saying the nastiest possible things in the nicest possible way, and President Trump was very good at that. And you just look at the results that we got. We healed the Gulf Rift between Qatar and the UAE and Bahrain and Egypt and Saudi. We got the Abraham Accords done, which people said was never going to happen. We got Serbia, Kosovo, which are now at each other's throats, but we got them to sign an economic normalization deal. So we even had a good deal in Afghanistan that unfortunately went south after we left. But the number of peace deals that we got because of President Trump's strength, but also his cordiality and his willingness to be a good diplomat, is something that I think history is going to look at 50 years from now when all the partisanship and the polarization has maybe cooled down a little bit. By the way, like with President Nixon, I think President Nixon's being totally reevaluated 50 years on. I think President Trump will be as well, and I think people will see the successes of the administration and understand them for the achievements and accomplishments that they were, putting aside some of the partisanship that we see, unfortunately, in the country today.
We could keep going around the world, but in the few minutes that we have left, I want to go back to what you said at the beginning when I asked you the question about how you prepare for your moment in the spotlight, your moment in history as being National Security Advisor. You brought up your wife, Lil Marie, who we all know and love. And I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but the two of you have been such an amazing example to me for so many years, most especially because you went through an unspeakable tragedy of losing a child, but you stayed strong, you stayed together, and you went on to achieve great things. I would just love, I think we all know what you think and feel about the world. I'd love for you to just tell us more about your marriage and your family and how that has made you the policymaker that you are today.
Well, I got married as a child. I think I was 21, Laura was 22. We met in college, and I was lucky enough to get a great wife, great woman that I met, who's been a partner with me the whole time. And the success our kids have had, I give Lomri all the credit. We had 2 Girl Scout Gold Awards and an Eagle Scout, and in our family it's God family country. We took the kids to church and prayed at every meal and prayed at night, and taught them that they were incredibly lucky to be born in America. I mean, there are very, very few countries that have the opportunities that you have here, and it's a blessing. I grew up as a middle-class kid in Santa Rosa, California, and had the opportunity to become a successful lawyer, national security advisor. I mean, where else can you do that in the world? There's very few places, and so I think Lomer and I realized we were fortunate and blessed, and we had a tradition of service in the military in our family, and then my 2 daughters now are doing great, and one's an Air Force pilot, one's an Army JAG officer, and they're both on active duty now, and we're very proud of them. And but again, the credit goes for that. All that goes to Lomer. I was working long hours and traveling a lot in the private sector and in government, and I had a great home front. And by the way, anyone who's in the service here, men and women, what your spouse has done when you're deployed or when you're off. Doing things, and I wasn't deployed in combat, but I was traveling around the world in my job capacity, and that's it's the spouses, the military spouses that are at home, taking care of families that we really owe a debt of gratitude to.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was amazing. Thank you for sharing the personal side, because I think that we all know what you were able to achieve on the policy side, but sort of peeling back and looking behind the curtain and knowing what it's like to be a national security advisor is I think something so many people in this room aspire to.
Get ASAP Rocky out of jail, and that's your best ticket to be an NSA.
There you go. So finally, in closing, what is your advice to you said nice things about Jake Sullivan. What is your advice to him in this administration in the final year and a half? Well,
it'd be presumptuous of me to give advice, and they probably wouldn't take it. But one of the things I've said recently is I never thought we'd be looking back at the Carter years as the good old days. And what I'll say about Jimmy Carter, and I grew up in those years, and some of you are old enough to remember, We lost Mozambique and Angola and Rhodesia and Nicaragua to the communists. And the bear was on the march. I remember there was a Time magazine cover page that had a big bear over the globe, and it looked like the Russians were going to run the table and win everything. And they invaded Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter came out and said, to his credit, he admitted to being naive. And he said, I was wrong. I was wrong about the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and we've got to change course as a country. And he boycotted the Summer Olympics in 1980. And what he did, Harold Brown, his defense secretary, started the defense buildup that became the Reagan defense buildup. People don't realize it actually started in the last year of the Carter administration, because Jimmy Carter had the integrity to admit that he was wrong and to change American policy. And what we need as Americans, this isn't a political issue, we need President Biden and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin and Jake, NSA Sullivan. They need to change policy, starting with Iran. We have to stop appeasing Iran. They're the largest state sponsor of terrorism. They've just engaged in this horrific attack on Israel. We've got to sanction the heck out of them. I know there's a debate that you were involved in, how effective that can be, but we need to put maximum pressure back on Iran. And we need to let the Iranians know that if this doesn't stop, there's going to be hell to pay. With the Ukraine, we've had our second big adversary, Russia, has invaded a sovereign country. And as Mike Waltz talked about very eloquently this morning, for those of you who are here, we've got to give the Ukrainians what they need, the tools they need to finish the job, and stop worrying about provoking Putin and start worrying about how we win the war in Ukraine. We've got to sanction the Russian Federation Central Bank and kick them out of SWIFT. Vladimir Putin and the Russians have made money on this war. Notwithstanding all the sanctions, the price of oil has gone up from $40 to $100 a barrel. Russia is doing very well with this war, and our sanctions have been meaningless because we haven't put the right sanctions in place. And then we've got to send a message to Xi Jinping and the country that is an existential threat to our way of life, to our liberty, to where our kids live and our grandkids are going to live, is the PRC and the Communist Party of China. And we've got to build a military that's so advanced and so strong that the Chinese understand that it would be foolhardy to attack us or our allies, whether it's Japan or Taiwan or South Korea or the ASEAN countries, India, which they've already attacked many times. They have to understand that we're back in the business of peace or strength. And that will protect our democratic allies in Taiwan. But what I'm terrified of, because I love the people of Taiwan very much, they're great people. I've been there several times. It's a wonderful place. They're next. We've seen Ukraine go down, or not go down, but at least get invaded. We've seen Israel be invaded. And Xi Jinping has got to be watching this thing, thinking there were so few consequences to the Russians and so few consequences so far to the Iranians for their invasions. Why shouldn't I invade China? Or why shouldn't I invade the Republic of China or Taiwan? And so we need to change course for the good of America and our partners, not for any political reason, not to say I told you so, but because it'll keep us safe and it'll keep our allies safe, just like Jimmy Carter changed course in 1979 and 1980. And that's the advice I'd have, whether it'll be taken or not. But I've gotten criticized for saying this. I want President Biden to succeed. I want Jake and Tony and Lloyd to succeed because it's good for us as Americans. And but unfortunately, they're not taking the policies they're putting in place now. It's not a personal issue. It's not a political issue. The policies that they're pursuing, especially with Iran and appeasement of Iran, and then this concern about provoking Russia, and frankly the appeasement and the kowtowing to China, is making us less safe. So I want them to change, not because it's good for us politically, but because it's good for us as Americans and keeping us and our kids safe and our grandkids safe.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Ambassador Robert O'Brien.
Thank you, Morgan. That was terrific.